This podcast is intended for investment professionals only. Hello, and welcome to this two-part series of Countdown to COP26. In November, Glasgow will play host to world leaders, heads of state, industry chiefs, and many more organisations passionate about tackling the current climate crisis in a summit that scientists say could determine the future of our planet. 6 years on from the 2015 Paris Agreement, the COP26 summit is seen as a seminal moment to ramp up environmental commitments, agree on carbon emission targets, and above all, renew collaboration in the face of the current climate crisis. I'm Frances Watson, and today I'm joined by Xuan Chan, Head of ESG in Real Assets, and Catherine Ogden, Sustainability and Responsible Investment Manager. In this podcast, and to paraphrase Greta Thunberg, we aim to cut through world leaders' blah, 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 and ask what is COP, what are its main objectives, and more specifically, what exactly is the role of the finance sector in helping to avert this climate crisis? Well, to answer these and more, I'm delighted to be joined by Xuan and Catherine. Welcome to LGIM Talks.
Hi, Frances. Thanks for having us.
Hi, Frances.
So, Catherine, for those of us who've never heard of COP26 before, and some won't really care, what is it and why should we care?
COP26, Frances, is the UN Global Climate Summit that, as you mentioned, is taking place in Glasgow in November. Now, it is really important because it's the 5-year review, 6 years due to the pandemic, of the commitments made at COP21 in 2015. And that was when the landmark Paris Agreement was signed. So what the Paris Agreement set out was an aim to limit the rise in global temperatures to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and preferably to 1.5 degrees. And this to significantly reduce the risks and impacts related to climate change. Now, it is this 1.5 degree target that has really come into focus since Paris, as the science continues to determine, an even greater urgency on this issue. And it's that 1.5 degree target that is really driving what has been termed a race to zero. What I think is key to remember is that really COP26 is widely seen as the world's last chance to get on a net zero emissions trajectory by 2030 and ultimately to limit temperature rises to 1.5.
And that sounds a bit alarmist, Catherine, because when you say the last chance, that's why people should be interested in what's being said at this summit. It's just the sense of urgency, isn't it, all round? Xuan, if I can turn to you then. I mean, LGIM's mantra, and we've been saying it for years, is to create a better future through responsible investing. And actually, our CEO, Michelle Scrimmager, will be co-chairing the business group. So from LGIM's point of view, what are our hopes for this particular COP?
Well, with less than 10 years of current emissions remaining effectively before we would have essentially exhausted the carbon budget of this 1.5 degrees that Catherine talked about, time is really running out to achieve the rapid, essentially large-scale emission reductions that's needed. So the climate pledges that countries made to deliver on their commitments to the Paris Agreement, they're also known as the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, lots of acronyms in the climate world. And when these were set in 2015 in Paris, they were far from ambitious enough to meet the end goal. So as Catherine mentioned, this COP26 is effectively a review, a critical review of all the commitments that will be needed to hopefully raise the climate ambition in line with the urgency set out by the climate science. So as you said, when Greta mentioned that, we need to cut through the world leaders, blah, blah, blah. I mean, what's great about Greta is she doesn't mince her words. And what she's really saying that in order to keep the 1.5 ambitions alive, we not only need to see more ambitious commitments by countries, but that these pledges should be supported by concrete policies and interim targets across national level and also across the private sector. Another key thing, objective of COP26 is for the nations to really agree a consensus on some kind of carbon pricing or regulation that needs to be clear and robust enough to support the case that the cost of burning fossil fuels is going to be too expensive. And this was a pivotal sticking point in finalizing what's called the Paris Agreement rulebook in the last few COPs since 2015. It's also referred to as Article 6 in the Paris Agreement. So from LGIM's perspective, we really hope to see an acceleration of carbon pricing, fossil fuel subsidy reform, phase out of thermal coal-based electricity generation, and effectively unlocking capital to emerging markets.
You did mention, Xuan, there's some concrete targets. And I know from what little I've read that there are some important initiatives, especially from China and the US, that have been announced in the run-up to the summit. I mean, just briefly tell us what they are, and do they go far enough again?
So I'll mention three. There are a few. There's more, and there will continue to be more leading up to COP. But I'll highlight three. The first significant one is President Xi from China announced that they will end funding for international coal power plants outside of China. And that is a significant advancement. Another important pledge is what's called the 30 by 30 commitment to protect 30% of the planet's land and ocean by 2030, which the UK has also signed up to. Just to add, there were 9 philanthropic groups, including the Bezos Earth Fund, that pledged $5 billion towards this 30 by 30 commitment. And so, biodiversity is a really important component towards our climate action plans. And finally, as you mentioned, the US, President Biden basically pledged at the UN General Assembly to double the US contribution to climate action up to $11.4 billion annually until 2024 towards a $100 billion annual target to effectively help vulnerable countries cope with the impacts of climate change.
It's interesting, though, because on that 100 billion target, and this is one for you, I guess, Catherine, I'd read somewhere that they haven't honoured that pledge. Why haven't they honoured it? And why is that pledge so important, that 100 billion?
Well, I mean, if we step back, Francis, finance is a key part of all climate negotiations. Now, in 2009, was when rich countries made this commitment. They pledged to provide at least 100 billion a year to the developing world by 2020 to help them tackle climate change. Now, as you say, this target was missed. Why does that matter? Well, developing countries do tend to be more vulnerable than the rich world to the impacts of climate change. And yet it is developed countries that have historically been the highest emitters, really creating the problem. Ensuring that poorer countries have the means to pursue clean development and to cope with really worsening impacts of climate change is not only key from a social and economic development perspective, but really it's important in order for those global emission targets that we all want and need to meet to be reached. There is also, I think, a question of trust. So if developing countries see that commitments made are not met, well, it potentially devalues all commitments and ultimately could undermine the efforts to strive for 1.5
and then collaboration breaks down, and then there we are back to square one. But talking of all parties in collaboration, I mean, this COP seems to be very government orientated. Maybe that's just because we've had press releases from just all the governments and from Boris Johnson a lot. Of course, UK is presiding over this summit. What's the role of the private sector? You know, you mentioned finance and how important that is. What is the role of the private sector then, Catherine, and institutional investors in particular?
Well, if we think about the enormity of the challenge, there some 30 to 50 trillion of incremental capital is required over the next 30 years to rebuild the world's energy system into a net zero sustainable system. Quite clearly, governments cannot finance this alone, never mind the worsening position and the immense strain that has been put on public finances by the pandemic. So the private sector has a crucial role to play, not only in reducing its own emissions, but in how it allocates capital and combined with that, the technical expertise to support and drive the transition. So I mentioned earlier the Race to Zero campaign of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. And this has been mobilizing not only state parties, but non-state actors like cities, like regions, like businesses, and indeed investors. And it's been mobilizing them to commit to achieving net zero by 2050. From the private sector, we've seen around 400 companies that have declared a net zero strategy. And that's alongside commitments from asset owners, where with more than 7 trillion of assets, and asset managers managing $43 trillion of assets that have all committed to net zero.
Are you saying then, Catherine, there's a lot of collaboration within the asset management industry itself or not?
Increasingly so, yes, and there needs to be, because this needs to be broached across the whole of the financial sector, across the value chain of investments. It is only going to be resolved if that is done. So with this in mind, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero was put in place to really bring together the net zero financial initiatives and to provide a platform to harmonise net zero standards across the sector.
Okay, so progress is being made. Shwen, actually, if I could just turn to you now, because I'd just like to drill down a little bit into your specialism. I mean, as head of ESG for the Real Assets division at LGIM, buildings contribute a fair amount to global emissions, don't they? They are what you would call serial offenders. What's going on in your sector, and what are you doing about it?
Yeah, I'm afraid we're guilty as charged. Indeed, buildings do contribute up to 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So really the built environment has undoubtedly a significant role to play in the transition to net zero. What is really exciting, though, to Catherine's point about the need for collaboration is there is a collective effort in the industry of which we are part of, by some of the largest real estate investors to drive towards net zero targets. So collaboration and scale is absolutely key here. In our real estate portfolio, we are already measuring carbon emissions. We have set energy and emission reduction objectives in line with science-based targets to 2030. And we're following the net zero principles set out by the UK Green Buildings Council. So it's about making sure that you set your action and plans against a robust industry standard. And since we published our net zero roadmap at the beginning of last year, we have been very busy actively implementing net zero carbon interventions across now growing number of key assets in our portfolio. We take a sort of whole life asset life cycle approach from the construction phase to in operations. And then I guess coming to our private credit portfolio, I would say there's going to be an increase in investment opportunities across new technology infrastructure. So I want to quote, I guess here, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who said recently in the conference in Milan, where he called for bold commitments on, I quote, coal, cars, cash, and trees, unquote. And he stressed it so much, he even mentioned it twice. And I would just add, I would add trains to that as well, because, for example, transportation is another sector on the brink of huge transformation. Just last week, I think if you saw the news, Network Rail and another company have announced that they are coming up with the next generation of battery-powered trains, which will be launched at COP26 and will run daily services throughout the whole conference. Another example, I'd say a few years ago, we financed one of Britain's leading train leasing companies. And part of the financing was to provide a more energy efficient and modern fleet of trains for its customers in the UK. And just this year, that company announced that it would partner with an industry consortium of partners in delivering what they're calling the Zero Emission Train Project, which is effectively providing expertise and investment in green hydrogen refueling infrastructure. So this is really exciting because this project will deliver Scotland's first hydrogen-powered train, offering, zero carbon alternative to the country's rail network. So essentially, infrastructure is an asset class that is really set to benefit disproportionately from the trends driving the shift to a more sustainable future.
That sounds really exciting. So what you just said, let's just hope the battery powered trains run more on time than the current ones. Catherine, let's just go back to you. How can we make sure all these commitments, all these initiatives that we've already talked about is just not a load of hot air?
Well, quite simply, hot air just isn't an option where we are now and where we need to get to. Institutional investors have such an important role to play in, expediting the transition, and that's through the capital owned and the capital managed. For LGIM, as a significant asset manager, what does that mean? For us, it means, we need to work in partnership with our asset owner clients on decarbonisation goals. We need to continue to create and develop and evolve investments aligned with net zero emissions. And we need to continue to influence the real economy transition by engaging and holding businesses accountable on their net zero transition plans. And we really need to up that ante, so to speak. And these are core elements of the commitments that LGIM has made as a founding signatory of the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative. But there's also a question of, okay, what does that translate to in terms of actual action day to day? What are we doing? What will we need to do? Well, if we think about, the first point is we've been doing a lot of work internally, drawing on industry best practice to set out a framework for net zero aligned funds. And this is considering some of the key commonalities in these frameworks, like portfolio construction, engagement, exclusion, not to mention, of course, the need to have net zero targets. And we're working to evolve our product offering aligned with net zero. Another key element, day-to-day in action, engagement. Now, our Climate Impact Pledge engagement programme is now in its 4th year. And in 2020 was expanded and updated to cover 15 climate critical sectors and 1,000 companies. Now, with that expansion, we have since been making an explicit effort to encourage companies to align their businesses to a net zero emissions trajectory. And we're sanctioning those that fall behind through our votes and through potential divestment.
Now, finally, Shwen, I understand you'll be going up to Glasgow. How realistic do you think your expectations are going to be as you walk into that conference room? Do you think you'll set the bar too high? Are you hoping for too much? Or how do you think you'll feel as you walk in? So
yeah, you're right. I am planning to be at COP in Glasgow with my hot water bottle, shall I add? And although I won't be part of the government negotiations, as I'll leave that in the good hands of Boris and the other heads of state, I feel optimistic, cautiously optimistic, but we have to be optimistic because a lot is at stake. Also, just to say, I will be there with our head of real assets, Bill Hughes. Bill is the UK Built Environment Climate Ambassador under the UK Green Buildings Council, where his role under the UK GBC is to mobilize the built environment sector ahead of COP26. So we will be there in our respective roles supporting this agenda. So you asked, what sort of mindset should we be going into COP? I guess, Francis, I would say, that phrase, life is a marathon, not a sprint. Well, I think this is different. When it comes to climate change, we need to act and we need to take action now because this is an emergency. So it is a sprint. It's not a marathon.
Okay, those are quite chilling words to end on. I feel like our planet's in A&E. But I feel your optimism as well. So thank you very much for this balanced podcast. And if you've enjoyed listening to Shwen and Catherine today, please do tune in to the second part of our COP26 Countdown to COP26 series, where Michelle Scrimmager, whom we mentioned on this podcast, will be talking to Lewis Pugh, who is the UN Patrons of the Oceans, and with whom Elgin has entered a partnership, actually, to raise awareness of the climate crisis. In the meantime, Shwen, Catherine, great to talk to you. Shwen, enjoy COP, and thanks for joining Elgin Talks. If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you can leave us a rating, or maybe even a review if you're feeling particularly generous, on the Apple Podcast app. It really helps new listeners to find us, and we're always on the lookout for new ways we can improve. As a reminder, this podcast is intended for investment professionals only and shouldn't be shared with a non-professional audience. This podcast should not be taken as an invitation to deal in legal and general investments. Any views expressed during this recording belong to the individuals and are based on market conditions at the time of the recording and do not reflect the views of legal and general investment management. Forward-looking statements are, by their nature, subject to significant risks and uncertainties and are based on internal forecasts and assumptions and should not be relied upon. Where individual stocks are mentioned, these do not constitute a recommendation to buy or sell any security and are for illustrative purposes only. Legal and general investment management is authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. For full terms and conditions, please visit our website. To find more great content, check us out on Twitter, LinkedIn, and our website, elgin.com.